For 6 years, the old woman came every single morning. Same time 6:47, never 6:45, never 6:50. Same table booth number 4 by the window, the one with the wobbly leg that nobody ever bothered to fix. Same order oatmeal with no brown sugar, black coffee, no cream. And when she left, she always placed the same thing on the table. A $2 bill, folded into a small triangle, sitting on top of the receipt like a quiet little signature. Not $3, not 5, 2. Every single day, for 6 years, $2. On the last day she ever walked through that door, she placed the triangle on the table the same way she always had. But this time, underneath it, she left something else, a thick envelope, old and slightly yellowed at the edges, sealed with tape. She looked at the waitress, said 4 words, "Don't open it yet," and walked out without looking back. When the waitress finally sat down alone in the back room and tore open that envelope, her hands were shaking before she even pulled out what was inside. And when she saw it, the letter, the check, and the photograph, she stopped breathing entirely, because she finally understood what $2 a day for 6 years had really meant. Her name was Caroline Hayes, and she had not slept more than 5 hours in a single night for the better part of 3 years. She was 34 years old, though most mornings she felt older. She had dark circles she'd stopped trying to cover, a ponytail she wore out of efficiency rather than style, and a pair of non-slip work shoes so worn down at the heel that she'd lined the inside with cardboard to keep out the cold from the tile floor. She worked the opening shift at Harbor Light Diner, a small breakfast and lunch spot on the edge of Savannah's quieter side, the kind of place with laminated menus and a pie case by the register, and a regular crowd of retirees who ordered the same thing every week, tipped in exact change. She liked the opening shift. She liked arriving before the sun came up, when the parking lot was still dark and the only sound was the hiss of the coffee machine warming up. She liked having 20 minutes alone in the dining room before the first customers arrived, wiping down tables, rolling silverware, listening to nothing. Those 20 minutes were the only part of her day that belonged entirely to her. Everything else belonged to someone or something else. The morning belonged to Noah. The afternoon belonged to the diner. The evening belonged to the second job she'd picked up 3 months ago at a bar 2 miles away, where she ran food and cleared glasses until midnight. The night belonged to whatever sleep she could catch before the alarm went off at 5. Noah was 7 years old and had his father's eyes and his grandmother's stubbornness and asthma that had put him in the hospital twice in the past 18 months. Every morning before she left the apartment, Carolyn checked his inhaler, made sure it was in his backpack, made sure it wasn't empty, made sure the backup was in the front zipper where he could reach it. Then she walked him across the hall to Mrs. Greer, their neighbor, who watched him before school for $20 a week and a plate of food on Sundays. Noah's father had been gone since the second hospitalization. He hadn't left a note. He'd left behind a box of his clothes in the closet and $400 in a shared bank account, and Caroline had used every cent of it on the hospital bill and never thought about Thomas again. Or she tried not to. The medical debt sat at a number she'd stopped looking at directly, the way you stop looking at a wound because looking at it makes it worse. She made her minimum payments. She worked her shifts. She did not complain, because complaining required energy she did not have, and because there was no one around to complain to anyway. At the diner, she was good at her job in the quiet, invisible way that good service workers often are, fast with refills, accurate with orders, able to read a table's mood within 30 seconds of approaching it. Her manager, a stocky man named Frank, who wore the same fleece vest every day of the year, trusted her to open without supervision and close the register without being checked. That was as close to a compliment as Frank got. She had worked at Harbor Light for 4 years when Margaret first walked in. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning where the light came in sideways through the diner windows and made everything look slightly amber. Caroline was refilling the coffee station when the bell above the door chimed, and a woman walked in alone. She was somewhere in her early 70s, white-haired, slim, dressed in a tan wool coat that had seen better years but was well kept. She moved carefully, like someone whose joints had opinions about the weather, but she held herself upright, and there was something intentional about the way she scanned the dining room before choosing her seat. She walked past 2 empty booths and settled into number 4, the one by the window with the wobbly leg, as though she'd sat there 100 times before. Caroline brought a menu. The woman didn't open it. "Oatmeal," she said. "No brown sugar. Black coffee." She paused. "Please." Caroline wrote it down out of habit, though there was nothing to forget. Coming right up. When she brought the food out, the woman was looking out the window at the parking lot, watching a mockingbird hop between 2 cars. She didn't look up when the bowl was set in front of her. She ate slowly, with a kind of focused calm, like someone who had learned not to rush meals. She left a clean plate and an untouched second cup of coffee that Caroline had refilled without being asked. When Caroline brought the check, the woman placed a $2 bill on the table. It had been folded into a tight triangle, 3 precise folds, the kind you had to do with intention. Caroline looked at it for a second, then took it without comment. She didn't think about it again, until the next morning, when the bell above the door chimed at 6:47 and the woman walked in, chose booth 4, ordered oatmeal and black coffee, and left another $2 triangle on the table. And the morning after that, and the morning after that. By the 3rd week, Caroline had stopped registering it as unusual and started registering it as simply a fact of the universe, the way you stop noticing a particular crack in the sidewalk after you've walked past it enough times. The woman she'd caught the name on a credit card receipt once. M. Sutton arrived at 6:47, ate slowly, looked out the window, left $2. Caroline learned her rhythms without meaning to. Margaret, she'd started thinking of her by first name, though she'd never used it aloud, liked her coffee at exactly the same temperature, which meant Carolyn brought a fresh cup at the 12-minute mark without being asked. She didn't want to chat. She didn't want to be checked on. She wanted to be left alone in a way that wasn't unfriendly, just self-contained. Caroline respected that. She was self-contained herself. The first time Margaret left a note, it was on a Thursday in November, written on a paper napkin in small, careful handwriting. The oatmeal was a little salty today, but the coffee was perfect. Caroline read it standing by the counter, and before she could stop herself, she smiled the first real smile she'd managed in at least 2 weeks. She folded the napkin and put it in her apron pocket. She wasn't sure why. A month later, on a Wednesday, her phone buzzed during the mid-morning rush. It was Noah's teacher. His breathing had tightened at recess. He was fine. The inhaler had worked, but could someone come by? Caroline told the teacher she'd arrange it and hung up. She walked into the supply room at the back, stood between the shelves of paper towels and industrial coffee cans, pressed her hand against the wall, and breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. She did not cry. She had learned how to get right up to the edge of crying and then step back from it, the way you learn to stop at a cliff. When she came back out, Margaret was still at her table, and something in the way the older woman looked at her, not with pity, not with curiosity, just with the steady attention of someone who didn't look away from things, made Caroline's throat tighten all over again. Margaret didn't say anything. She just pushed the coffee cup toward the edge of the table toward Caroline and gave a small, single nod. Caroline stood there for a moment. Then, she picked up the cup and took a sip. It was still warm. She didn't know why that small thing undid her slightly. She put the cup down, thanked her quietly, and went back to work. But something had shifted, barely, like a door that had been stuck for a long time moving just a fraction of an inch. Over the following months, the napkin notes continued. Occasionally funny, I believe that mockingbird in your parking lot has claimed the blue Civic. Occasionally observational. You're right-handed but you carry your tray on the left. Old injury? Caroline started writing back. Short answers at first, slipped under the check. Then, slightly longer ones. A kind of slow, unhurried conversation conducted entirely in handwriting, 2 or 3 sentences at a time, across the same $4 breakfast. One morning in the early spring, Caroline arrived at the diner with a worn anatomy textbook in her bag. She'd found it at the thrift store the week before and bought it on impulse for $2 and had been reading it at the bar between rush periods. She hadn't told anyone. It felt too fragile to say out loud, the way some things do. She didn't notice Margaret looking at the bag until she was clearing the table and the older woman spoke. You were studying to be a nurse, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Caroline stopped. How did you? The book. Margaret nodded at the bag. And the way you looked at the paramedics when they came in last month for the man who fainted. Like you were running through a checklist in your head. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A long time ago." What happened? The dining room was filling up. A table by the door needed coffee. Someone had flagged her from the counter. Caroline picked up the empty oatmeal bowl and said, simply, "Life," and walked away. But Margaret's question followed her through the rest of the shift and into the evening and into the thin hours before sleep. Because nobody had asked her that in years. Not her mother, before she passed. Not Frank. Not anyone. What happened? She had been 26, accepted into a licensed practical nursing program at the community college 20 minutes from where she lived. She'd had the enrollment paperwork on the kitchen table, a plan, a timeline, then the phone call from the ER. Then the week in the hospital with Noah, watching him breathe through a mask. Then the bill. Then the second bill. Then Thomas leaving. Then the third bill. And the paperwork was still on the table when she finally threw it away 3 months later because looking at it had started to feel like looking at something that had died. She'd kept the anatomy book, though. She'd always kept the books. The hours cut came on a Monday, slipped into her schedule the way bad news usually arrives quietly. Already decided. Nothing to discuss. Frank left a revised schedule on the corkboard by the time clock without mentioning it to her directly. Carolyn saw it during her break, standing in her coat in the back hallway with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. 3 shifts gone. 14 hours a week. Just like that. The diner had been slower. Lately she'd noticed it herself. The empty booths stretching longer into the morning. The lunch crowd thinning, but noticing it and having it land on her paycheck were 2 different kinds of knowing. She did the math standing right there in the hallway. Rent was due in 11 days. Noah had a follow-up appointment at the pulmonologist the week after that, and his new prescription ran $62 even with the discount card. There was a past due notice from the hospital billing department sitting on her kitchen counter that she'd been turning face down every morning so she wouldn't see it first thing. She put the schedule back on the board, finished her coffee, and went back out to her tables. That night, she called the bar where she already worked weekend evenings and asked if they had anything on weeknights. The manager said he could give her Tuesdays and Thursdays if she could start at 9. She said yes before he finished the sentence. She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed doing the new math. It worked. Barely, if nothing unexpected happened. Noah had the bad night 2 weeks later. She heard him through the wall at 1A. That particular sound, the tight, effortful breathing that she had learned to identify in her sleep, literally, her body coming alert before her conscious mind did. She was in his room, with the nebulizer running within 90 seconds. He sat upright in bed, small and serious, holding the mask to his face the way she'd taught him, his eyes finding hers over the top of it, with an expression that broke something in her every single time. Not fear. Exactly. But the particular exhaustion of a 7-year-old who had been through this enough times to know what it was. "I'm okay, Mom," he said, muffled through the mask. "I know," she said. "I know you are." She sat on the edge of his bed with her hand on his back, feeling his ribcage rise and fall, and did not move for 40 minutes. When his breathing evened out and he tipped sideways into sleep, she carried the nebulizer back to the hallway, sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, and stayed there until the light under the front door turned gray. She was at the diner by 5:30. At 6:47, the bell above the door chimed. Margaret took one look at her and didn't say anything for a long moment. She sat down, ordered her oatmeal and her coffee, and ate in her usual quiet way. When Caroline brought the check, the $2 triangle was already on the table, and under it was a napkin. Caroline picked it up after Margaret left. Sleep. Even 1 hour counts. Caroline folded it into her apron pocket with the others. She had a small collection of them, by now a handful of napkins she'd moved from apron to the kitchen drawer at home without quite being able to throw them away. 3 weeks after the hours cut, on a slow Wednesday morning, when only 2 other tables were occupied, Margaret arrived at her usual time, ordered her usual breakfast, and then did something she had never done before. When Caroline came to refill her coffee, Margaret looked up and said, "Sit down for a minute." Caroline glanced at the room. Frank was in the office, The other tables were settled. She hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from Margaret and sat perching on the edge of it, one hand still holding the coffee pot, as though staying partially upright meant she wasn't really doing this. "Tell me what stopped you," Margaret said. "The nursing program. Tell me the actual story." "I told you," Caroline said. "Life. That's not a story. That's a summary." Caroline looked at her. Margaret looked back, without urgency, without pushing, just with that steady attention that she'd had from the very beginning, the quality of someone who was genuinely willing to wait. And maybe it was the 3 weeks of bad sleep, or the number on the hospital bill she'd finally turned face up the night before, or simply the accumulated weight of years of keeping everything folded neatly inward. But Caroline put the coffee pot down on the table and told her. Not everything, but enough. The acceptance letter, the plan she'd had, the careful, specific plan. She'd even mapped out the bus routes to the college, she said. She'd done that. She'd actually looked up the bus routes, and then the call from the ER, and then Noah, and then Thomas, who had said he was going to step up and then recalibrated his own life in a way that didn't include the two of them. And then the bills, arriving with the regularity of something that did not care about context. "I kept the books," she said, and she wasn't sure why. She added that, but it felt important. Margaret nodded slowly. "You kept the books," she repeated, as though confirming something. A beat of quiet sat between them. At the counter, one of the regulars pushed his mug toward the edge for a refill. Caroline saw it, but didn't move yet. "I had a plan," she said, more quietly. "It was a real plan. I wasn't just saying it." "I know," Margaret said. I had to choose." "You made the right choice," Margaret said. "And it cost you something real." Both of those things are true at the same time. Carolyn looked down at the table. She pressed her thumbnail against the edge of the laminate, a small private pressure, something to hold on to. "There are people," Margaret said, her voice calm and unhurried, "who are made for certain things, not in a grand way. Just the particular shape of who they are fits the particular shape of the work. I've known a few of them in my life." She paused. "You're one of them." Caroline didn't respond. She picked up the coffee pot and stood up. "I should get back." Margaret nodded. She folded her napkin, placed it beside the empty bowl, and said nothing else. Caroline walked back to the counter and refilled the regular's mug and took an order at table 6. And the morning continued the way mornings do, one task folding into the next. But she thought about what Margaret had said for the rest of that day, and the next. She found herself, in the small hours at the bar, between runs to the kitchen, doing mental arithmetic of a different kind, not bills and shifts and minimums, but something more like possibility, which she hadn't attempted in a long time because possibility, when it doesn't work out, hurts more than never trying. She wasn't ready to call it anything. She just let it sit there, small and unexamined. The 2 weeks Margaret was gone felt strange in a way Caroline didn't expect. She noticed at first on the third morning the specific quality of 6:47 passing without the bell above the door chiming. She caught herself looking up at the wrong time, recalibrating when booth 4 stayed empty. It irritated her slightly that she'd noticed. She wasn't the kind of person who got attached to routines that weren't her own. She asked Gail, one of the other morning regulars, if she'd seen the woman who usually sat by the window. Gail said she hadn't. She asked Frank, who said he had no idea what she was talking about. She didn't ask anyone else. On the 14th morning, the bell chimed at 6:47. Caroline was at the coffee station with her back to the door, and she knew before she turned around. She set the carafe down, turned, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a small release she hadn't known she'd been holding. Margaret looked thinner. The wool coat that had always fit precisely now sat slightly loose at the shoulders. Her hands, when she wrapped them around the coffee cup Caroline brought, had a faint tremor that hadn't been there before. She moved more carefully than usual, getting into the booth, and her voice when she ordered was quieter, conserving something. She ate her oatmeal slowly. She looked out the window. She left her $2 triangle on the table. Caroline did not ask where she had been. Some instinct told her that the question would land wrong. Instead, as she cleared the bowl, she leaned down slightly and said, quietly, "I'm glad you're back." Margaret looked up at her. For a moment, her expression held something that was almost private, a small movement behind the eyes, the kind of thing that surfaces and then gets put away again quickly. Then, she said, simply, "Thank you, Caroline." It was the first time she had used her name. Caroline stood upright and moved on to the next table, but the words stayed with her the rest of the morning. "Caroline," said with full attention, "the way you say someone's name when you mean it." She was wiping down booth 4 after Margaret left when she noticed something on the floor near the base of the seat, a small photograph, the kind printed on matte paper, slightly bent at one corner. It must have slipped from Margaret's coat pocket or her wallet when she'd shifted to stand. Caroline picked it up. It showed a young woman in a nurse's uniform, white scrubs, a hospital ID clipped to the front pocket, standing in front of what looked like a hospital entrance. She was smiling at the camera with the slightly self-conscious smile of someone who didn't usually let herself be photographed. Caroline didn't flip it over at first. She just looked at the woman's face, which meant nothing to her and yet snagged something in her attention that she couldn't name. She slipped the photo into her apron pocket and went to the door, but the parking lot was already empty. Margaret had gone. That evening, alone in the kitchen while Noah slept, Caroline took the photo out and turned it over. The handwriting on the back said, "The woman who saved Diane, Ruth Hayes, Mercy General, 2004. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put it in the kitchen drawer, with the napkins. She told herself it meant nothing. Hayes was not an uncommon name, but she did not sleep well that night, and she was not entirely sure why. Margaret came back the following Tuesday, and the pattern resumed. 647, booth 4, oatmeal and black coffee, $2 triangle, but it had a different quality now, the way a familiar song sounds different when you know it's almost over. Caroline couldn't have explained how she knew. She just knew, the way you know certain things about people when you've watched them closely enough for long enough. Margaret was slower, not dramatically, but Caroline noticed. The coat hung looser each week. She ate less of the oatmeal, pushing the last third around the bowl, in a way that was less about appetite and more about having something to do with her hands. But her eyes were the same, still sharp, still attentive, still capable of that quality of looking that made you feel seen in a way that was not always comfortable but was always honest. One morning she came out of the kitchen to find Margaret sitting very still, both hands flat on the table, eyes closed, not sleeping, but gathering something, waiting out a wave of pain or dizziness. Caroline slowed her pace, gave her a moment, then approached quietly and refilled the coffee without saying anything. Margaret opened her eyes, looked at her, and said, "Don't make a fuss." "I'm not making a fuss," Caroline said. "I'm refilling your coffee." Margaret almost smiled. "Good." Caroline went back to her other tables, but she positioned herself for the rest of that morning so that booth 4 was always in her peripheral vision. The last morning arrived on a Thursday in April, though Caroline didn't know it was the last morning until it was already over. She noticed something was different before Margaret even sat down. It was in the way she moved from the door to the booth, each step considered, the way someone moves when they are using a portion of their energy just to appear as though they are not. She wore the tan wool coat and a scarf Caroline hadn't seen before, pale blue, which she didn't take off even after she sat down. She ordered her oatmeal and her coffee. She ate less than usual, maybe a third of the bowl, slow spoonfuls with pauses between them. She looked out the window at the parking lot for a long time, at the mockingbird that had apparently been resident in that lot for as long as anyone could remember, hopping between the same two cars it always had. It was close to 8 o'clock when Caroline came to clear the mostly untouched bowl. Margaret was ready. Caroline could see it in the way she was sitting upright, composed, the posture of someone who has organized themselves to do something. Both hands were in her lap. She looked at Caroline directly when she approached, full attention with no preamble. "Sit with me for a minute," she said. Caroline looked at the room, looked back at Margaret, sat down. They looked at each other across the table for a moment, without speaking. Outside, a truck pulled into the parking lot, and the mockingbird lifted from the hood of the blue Civic and disappeared into the oak at the lot's edge. Margaret reached into the inside pocket of her wool coat and brought out an envelope. It was thick, the paper slightly yellowed, sealed with a strip of tape across the flap. She had prepared a second copy of the photograph, the same image she'd been carrying for years, printed again so that Caroline could keep one. She set the envelope on the table between them. Then she unfolded the $2 bill from her coat pocket, already folded into its triangle, and placed it on top of the envelope. "Not yet," Margaret said. "Wait until you're alone." Carolyn looked at the envelope, then at Margaret. Something in the quality of the moment made her not ask questions. She reached out and took the envelope without speaking, and held it in both hands in her lap. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then she said, quietly and without ceremony, "You are going to be a very good nurse, Caroline." Her voice was steady. It was not said as encouragement or as hope. It was said as fact, the way you state something you have had sufficient time to become certain of. Caroline's throat closed. She pressed her lips together and nodded once, because it was all she could manage. Margaret nodded back. She gathered herself slowly and slid out of the booth, steadying herself with one hand on the table's edge. As she stood, she straightened her scarf. She buttoned the top button of her coat. "Take care of that boy," she said. Then she walked toward the door, carefully, and pushed it open into the April morning. The bell above it chimed once, the same as it had every day for 6 years. She did not look back. Caroline sat in booth 4 and watched the door settle shut, the envelope in her lap, the $2 triangle sitting on the table where the oatmeal bowl had been. Then the table in the back corner flagged her, and she stood up, slipped the envelope into her apron, and went back to work. She waited until 11:15, when the morning rush had thinned and Frank was in the office, and the only occupied tables were 2 regulars who needed nothing. She went to the back room and sat down in the plastic chair, and she took the envelope out of her apron. She held it for a moment. It was heavier than she'd expected. The paper was soft with age, as though it had been handled and resealed more than once. She peeled the tape back carefully. Inside were 3 things. The first was a letter 3 pages, handwritten on cream-colored stationery in the same small, careful script she recognized from the napkins. She set it aside for a moment without reading it, because something told her to take inventory first. The second was a check. She unfolded it and looked at the number, and her brain did something strange. It registered the figures, but didn't immediately process them, the way you read a word several times before it resolves into meaning. She looked at it again. The number didn't change. She set it down on top of the letter. The third was a photograph, matte paper, slightly bent at one corner. She recognized it before she fully understood why it was the same image as the photograph she'd found on the floor 3 weeks ago, the one now sitting in her kitchen drawer. Margaret had kept one copy for years and prepared a second one for this envelope so Caroline could have her own. She turned it over. The handwriting on the back said, "The woman who saved Diane, Ruth Hayes, Mercy General, 2004. The supply room went very quiet. Caroline turned the photograph back over and looked at the woman's face again, at the jaw, the angle of the eyes, the particular way the smile turned up slightly higher on the left side than the right, and something in her chest cracked open in a way that was almost physical, a sensation like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed shut for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She picked up the letter and began to read. "Dear Caroline, I have written this letter 4 times. The first 3 times I threw it away because I was trying to explain myself before I'd told you what I needed to tell you, which is the wrong order. So I will try to start at the right place this time. 12 years ago, my daughter Diane was in a car accident on I-16, just east of Savannah. She was 29 years old. She was brought into Mercy General with internal bleeding and a closed head injury, and for the first several hours the doctors told me she was stable, and I believed them, because I didn't know enough then to understand that stable and safe are not the same thing. There was a nurse on the overnight shift, a young woman, early 30s, who had been on her feet since 7 in the morning and had 3 other patients, and still took the time to sit with Diane during the quiet hours and monitor her in a way that went beyond what was required. At 2 in the morning, she noticed something in Diane's breathing pattern that the overnight resident had not flagged. She went directly to the attending. She was not wrong. Diane had developed a pulmonary complication that, left unnoticed for another hour, would very likely have killed her. The nurse's name was Ruth Hayes. I know because I asked, afterward, and the charge nurse told me, and I wrote it down and kept it. I asked to speak with her, to thank her, but I was told she had ended her shift and gone home. I came back the next day and was told she had transferred to another department. I tried through the hospital's administration and was told they couldn't share personnel information. I tried other ways. Over the years, I found out, much later, that she had passed away. I'm sorry to tell you this way, in a letter. I'm sorry I cannot say it to you gently. I found you by accident, which is the truest kind of finding. I came into Harbor Light Diner on a Tuesday morning in October because it was close to a medical appointment and I needed somewhere to sit quietly for a while. When you brought my coffee and I looked at your name tag, I thought, Hayes is a common name, and I ordered my breakfast and I sat there and I watched you work, and somewhere in the second cup of coffee, I understood that it was not a coincidence. I don't know how to explain that certainty more precisely than that. I just knew. I didn't say anything that first morning because I didn't know how. I came back the next morning because I still didn't know how. And then I kept coming back, and I kept not knowing how, and then I stopped trying to find the how, and I just stayed. Because staying felt like the thing I could do. Staying, and coming back, and leaving what little I could, and watching. I watched you for 6 years, Caroline. I watched you carry things that no one should have to carry alone. I watched you keep going on mornings when I could see it cost you everything just to walk through that door. And I watched you keep those books in your bag, year after year, and that told me everything I needed to know about who you are. The money in this envelope is not charity. It is not pity. It is not a gift in any ordinary sense of the word. It is a debt my family has owed yours for 12 years, and which I am only able to pay in part, because what your mother did for my daughter cannot be fully repaid in any currency I know of. Use it for Noah. Use it for the program. Use it for whatever the next thing is. The $2 every morning was not a tip. I want you to know what it was. It was my way of saying, I see you. I am here. You are not alone. With love and with gratitude that I do not have adequate words for. Margaret Sutton. Caroline read the letter once. Then she sat still for a while. Then she read it again. Outside the supply room, she could hear the diner, the low murmur of conversation, the scrape of a chair, the bell above the door chiming as someone came in or left. The ordinary sounds of a morning that was continuing without her, the way mornings do. She looked at the photograph, at her mother's face, at the smile that turned up higher on the left than the right, which was also her own smile, and Noah's smile, and which she had not been able to look at in a photograph for years, because looking at photographs of her mother was the kind of hurt that did not diminish with time, it just became more familiar. She sat in the plastic chair with the letter in one hand and the photograph in the other for a long time. Then she folded them carefully, placed them back in the envelope with the check, tucked the envelope into her apron, stood up, checked that her face was in order, and went back out to her tables. She worked the rest of the shift. She smiled at the right moments. She refilled coffees and ran food and cleared plates. She did her job, but something had changed in her, quietly and completely, in the way that real changes happen not in a flash, but in the moment you finally look at something you've been not looking at for a very long time and find that you can bear it, and that bearing it is the first step toward something else. She found the address on the second page of the letter, written at the bottom in smaller script, as though Margaret had added it as an invitation she wasn't sure would be accepted. Harbor Pines Care Center. Room 14. Caroline looked it up that evening after Noah was in bed. It was 11 miles from the diner, on the far side of town, where the roads widened and the oak trees grew older and closer together. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand and the envelope in front of her, the check and the letter and the photograph arranged in a row. She had not cashed the check. She had not told anyone about the envelope. She had gone to work Friday and Saturday and Sunday and moved through her shifts the way she always did, and booth 4 had been empty all 3 mornings. She needed those days, not from avoidance, but from the particular kind of processing that can only happen in the ordinary motions of daily life, making Noah's lunch, folding laundry at midnight, watching him measure rainfall in his notebook at the kitchen table. She needed to let what she'd read settle into her before she could carry it into a room and speak it aloud. On Monday morning, she dropped Noah at Mrs. Greer's an hour early, drove past the diner without stopping, and took the long road south toward Harbor Pines. The care center was a low building set back from the road behind a row of well-kept azaleas that were just beginning to bloom, pale pink in the early morning light. The lobby was clean and quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that belongs to places where time moves differently, slower, and more deliberate. Every hour acknowledged rather than rushed through. A woman at the front desk looked up when Caroline came in. "I'm here to see Margaret Sutton," Caroline said. "Room 14. The woman checked something on her screen. "Are you family?" Caroline hesitated for only a moment. "Yes," she said. The woman nodded and gave her a visitor's badge and pointed her down the hall. Room 14 was at the end of the corridor, the last door on the left. It was partly open. Caroline stopped outside it and stood there for a moment, one hand raised toward the door frame, the envelope tucked under her arm. She could hear the sound of the room, the low hum of medical equipment, the distant sound of birdsong from a window somewhere. She thought about all the mornings she had stood at the edge of Margaret's table, deciding whether to stop or keep moving. All the times she had kept moving. She knocked lightly and pushed the door open. The room was small and simply arranged: a bed, a chair, a window that looked out onto a courtyard garden where a bird feeder hung from a shepherd's hook and two sparrows were conducting an argument over the seed tray. There was a single framed photograph on the bedside table, angled toward the bed. Margaret was in the bed, propped against two pillows, a thin blanket pulled to her waist. She was awake. She looked smaller here than she had at the diner without the wool coat, without the context of the booth and the window and the mockingbird and the ordinary morning around her. She was simply a woman at the end of a long life, occupying a small room with great patience. When she saw Caroline in the doorway, something moved across her face, not surprise, but the expression of someone who has hoped for something without quite letting themselves count on it, and who is now recalibrating. "You came," she said. "I came," Caroline said. She walked in and sat down in the chair beside the bed, the envelope in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sparrows outside reached some resolution and went quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Caroline took the check out of the envelope and held it out. "I can't take this," she said. Margaret looked at the check without touching it. "Yes, you can. It's too much." "It's not enough," Margaret said, simply and without drama. "It's not close to enough. But it's what I have." Caroline kept her hand extended. Margaret kept her hands in her lap. They held this arrangement for a moment, the check between them, until Caroline slowly lowered her hand and set the check on the edge of the bed. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "In the beginning, why didn't you just say it?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking toward the window. The bird feeder swayed slightly in a breeze Caroline couldn't feel from where she was sitting. "Because I didn't know what I was coming to tell you," Margaret said at last. "When I first walked in and saw your name, I thought I would sit down and drink my coffee and then tell you who I was and why I was there. That was the plan." A small pause, "But then I watched you work for 20 minutes, and I could see how hard things were. And I thought, if I walk up to this woman and tell her that her mother saved my daughter's life, and then I hand her money and leave, what have I done? I've made myself feel better. I've discharged a debt. But I haven't." She stopped, started again. "I wanted to know you first. I wanted to know if you were all right. And then I could see that you weren't. Not entirely. And I didn't want to leave until—" She paused again, and this time, the pause was longer, the kind that has weight to it. "I'm an old woman who made a decision and kept making it for 6 years. I don't know that I can explain it more clearly than that." Caroline looked at her hands in her lap. The envelope, lighter now without the check. The photograph still inside it. "She never told me," Caroline said quietly, "about Diane. My mother never mentioned it." "No," Margaret said. "She wouldn't have. That was the kind of person she was, I think. From what little I knew of her, she did her job, and she went home, and she didn't require anything for it. Not recognition, not acknowledgement. She just did the thing that needed doing." Caroline pressed her lips together. Her eyes were stinging, and she let them, for once, without retreating from it. "I look like her," she said. It wasn't a question. "Very much," Margaret said. They sat with that for a moment. "She would have been proud of you," Margaret said. Whatever you decide to do next, but especially if you go back. Caroline nodded slowly, one hand pressed flat against the envelope in her lap. She thought about the anatomy book in her bag, dog-eared and annotated in 2 different pens, notes in the margins she'd made in the dim light of the bar between rushes. She thought about the bus route she'd looked up once, years ago, to the community college. She thought about Noah, his serious eyes over the nebulizer mask, the particular way he said "I'm okay, Mom," with so much certainty, as though he was the one reassuring her. She thought about what it would mean to become someone who could walk into a room the way her mother had walked into Diane's room on that overnight shift, someone who knew what to look for, who stayed when staying mattered, who caught the thing that everyone else had missed. "I'm going to go back," she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud, to anyone, in years. The words felt strange and solid in the air between them, like something that had weight now that it had been spoken. Margaret looked at her steadily. "I know," she said. They talked for 2 hours. Margaret told her about Diane, not the accident, not the hospital, but Diane as a person, her work as an elementary school art teacher in Augusta, her husband, her 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5. She told Caroline that Diane knew she was here, knew about the diner, knew about Caroline, that Diane had wanted to come herself, but had waited for Margaret's word on when. Caroline told her about Noah, not the asthma, not the bills, not the hard nights, but Noah as a person, his obsession with weather systems, the way he'd been tracking rainfall totals in a notebook since he was 5, his absolute conviction that he would one day be a meteorologist named Dr. Noah Hayes. She told it with a lightness in her voice that surprised her, the ease of talking about him to someone who wanted to hear it. At some point during the second hour, Margaret's eyes grew heavier, and the pauses between her sentences stretched longer, and Caroline understood that the visit had taken something out of her that she didn't have a large reserve of anymore. She reached over and pulled the blanket up slightly, the automatic gesture of someone accustomed to caring for people. Margaret didn't object. Before Caroline stood to go, she reached across and took Margaret's hand. It was thin and cool, the bones close to the surface. Margaret's fingers curled around hers with a grip that was weaker than it looked but deliberate. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying, and they both knew it. 2 women connected by a thread that had been stretched across 12 years and 2 generations, pulled taut by grief and coincidence and $2 a day, and which had finally, in this small room on a Monday morning in April, been allowed to hold the full weight of what it carried. Caroline sat like that for a while. Then she squeezed Margaret's hand gently, stood up, and picked up her things. At the door, she paused and turned back. Margaret's eyes were closed, but her face was composed, settled, the face of someone who has finished the last thing on a long list. Caroline walked out into the corridor, and then out through the lobby, and then into the morning, which had warmed while she'd been inside. Margaret Sutton died 4 days later, on a Friday morning, quietly and in her sleep. The staff at Harbor Pines called the number Caroline had left with the front desk. She drove out alone, in the early afternoon, and sat in the empty room for a little while. The bird feeder was still in the courtyard. The sparrows had the seed tray to themselves. She was there when Diane arrived, a woman in her early 40s with her mother's straight posture and the reddened eyes of someone who had been crying in the car. They looked at each other in the doorway of room 14, and there was a moment that required no introduction, no explanation, no language. 2 women who had never met and who were already, in some particular and permanent way, known to each other. Diane said, "She talked about you every week." Caroline said, "She changed everything." They stood together in the room for a long time. When they left, they exchanged numbers in the parking lot, with the slightly tentative care of people who intend to stay in touch and mean it. 4 years and 3 months after the morning she opened the envelope, Caroline Hayes completed her licensed practical nursing program at Savannah Technical College and accepted a position at Mercy General Hospital. Same building, same wing, same floor where Ruth Hayes had worked the overnight shift in 2004. On the morning of her first official day, she left Noah, 15 now, taller than her, still keeping his rainfall notebook with Mrs. Greer, who had refused all these years to accept more than the original $20 a week and a Sunday plate. She drove to Harbor Light Diner, It was early, just past 6, and the sky was still that particular shade of dark blue that belongs to the last few minutes before dawn properly arrives. She parked in the lot where the Mockingbird had held its long residency, though she hadn't seen it in a year or two and assumed it had moved on in the way that living things do. She went inside. The diner had changed some new laminate on the countertops, a different pie case, a young woman she didn't recognize behind the register. But booth 4 was exactly as it had always been, wobbly leg and all, and Caroline sat down in it and looked out the window at the parking lot and the oak at the far edge of the lot and the sky beginning to lighten in the east. The young waitress came over, early 20s, quick-moving, a name tag that said Amy, and Caroline ordered oatmeal with no brown sugar and a black coffee. She ate slowly. She looked out the window. She thought about her mother in scrubs, in front of a hospital entrance, squinting slightly into the camera, smiling the way Caroline smiled, the way Noah smiled. She thought about Margaret's hand in hers, cool and purposeful. She thought about room 4, in Mercy General's overnight wing, where she would be standing in 2 hours. When Amy brought the check, Caroline took a $2 bill from her coat pocket. She had folded it before she left the apartment, 3 precise folds, the kind you have to do with intention. She set it on top of the receipt. She left it there and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Amy approach the table, heard the small pause that meant the girl had picked it up and was turning it over, looking at the neat triangle of it, puzzled by the care of the fold. Caroline pushed the door open. The bell above it chimed once. She walked out into the morning, which had turned gold while she wasn't looking.